Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning into this webinar for PCCD's fiscal year 24-25 School Safety and Security and Mental Health Grants. My name is Kirsten Kenyon, and I serve as the Director of the Office of Research at PCCD, and my office is responsible for administering the school safety grants here at PCCD. First, a quick overview of what I'll cover today in this presentation. I'll kick things off with a brief overview of our agency, and then I'm going to do a quick recap of the non-competitive school safety and mental health grants funding announcement and the application process. I'll cover the anticipated funding timeline, including some important upcoming deadlines. I'll then conclude by going over some frequently asked questions that have been submitted to PCCD by participants and some other questions we've received so far. So let's go ahead and get started. First, a little bit about our agency. Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency, or PCCD, was established in 1978 through Pennsylvania state law and serves as the Commonwealth's justice planning and policymaking agency. Our mission is to enhance the quality, coordination, and planning within the criminal and juvenile justice systems to facilitate the delivery of services to victims of crime and to increase the safety of our communities. We're a relatively small state agency housed within the executive offices, with approximately 150 employees working across 4 offices. PCCD's responsibilities and programs fall into a number of different areas, including funding and grants, technical assistance, data and research, victims compensation, training, and other things. If you're interested in learning more about these areas, I highly encourage you to check out our website at pccd.pa.gov. So let's start with a general overview of the fiscal year 24-25 school safety grants and getting into some of the details of this particular funding announcement. The primary purpose of the fiscal year 24-25 school safety and mental health grants program is to provide non-competitive grants to school districts, charter schools, intermediate units, and area career and technical centers to support physical security enhancements, behavioral health improvements, or both. It is totally up to you as the school entity to decide how you would like to expend your funding for this particular solicitation. As with the last 2 school safety grant program solicitations, there is still a provision in the law that ensures that eligible school entities should first meet Level 1 baseline criteria prior to expending funding on more advanced activities. You can always use your school safety grant funding to help you meet any Level 1 baseline gaps you might have. Also, if your school entity already meets Level 1 baseline criteria, that's great. Then you can expend your funding on any other eligible physical security or behavioral health activities, respectively. For those of you on the webinar that are new to the concept of baseline criteria, I'll get into what that means and a little later on in the presentation. So for fiscal year 24-25, a total of $100 million in state funding was set aside for this non-competitive formula-based school safety solicitation. We expect to fund around 778 grants under this solicitation. The amount of funding that an eligible school entity can request is based on formula criteria that is established in the actual school code. That means that school districts are eligible for a base amount of $100,000 each, plus an additional bump based on their 22-23 adjusted average daily membership. Other eligible school entities, such as IUs, charter schools, and career and technical centers, can request up to $70,000 in total. You can look up the maximum award amount your school entity can request in Appendix A of the written funding announcement. We have that calculated out for you. Grant funding can then be used to support project activities over a 2-year period, generally from July 1, 2024 through June 30th, 2026. In general, the project period dates can be pretty fluid, particularly the end date, if you're experiencing challenges expending all your funding. You can submit what are called project modification requests, or PMRs, to us to help extend deadlines if necessary. Again, per the law, only school districts, intermediate units, career and technical centers, and charter schools, and that means regional charter schools, cyber charter schools, and regular charter schools, are eligible for funding under this solicitation. If your school entity does not fall into one of these 6 eligible school entity types, you are not eligible to seek funding under the solicitation. If that's the case, we would encourage you, though, to check out the Targeted School Safety Grant Program for non-public schools as a possible alternative source of funding. As I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are not familiar with the baseline criteria standards, let me provide you with an overview. In 2021, the School Safety and Security Committee adopted an initial set of what were called baseline criteria standards that schools could use to help guide their decisions about physical security and behavioral health needs. To develop these criteria, a group of experts throughout Pennsylvania was tapped to provide insights into what the most basic or standard level of physical security a school should provide for its students, while a similar work group of experts devised a similar approach for behavioral health needs. The criteria documents, which are on our website, they organize behavioral health and safety and security related equipment, trainings, policies, programs, and activities into a multi-leveled structure that is from level 1, which would be the most basic elements that a school should have in place, to level 3, which would be the most advanced activities or items or personnel that a school should have in place to ensure the security needs of their schools. The School Safety and Security Committee's goal is that every school entity in Pennsylvania should, at a minimum, meet the basic level 1 standard of service for students prior to expending funding and resources on more advanced activities, items, and services. As with the grant solicitations that were released in fiscal year 22-23 and in fiscal year 23-24, school entities will be asked first if you meet all of the level 1 baseline criteria. If a school entity does not meet all level 1 criteria, they can use their funding here to help meet their gaps. Or if they cannot meet all the gaps, they can be limited in expending their funding on other level 1 eligible items. It's a bit like do not pass go in Monopoly. If you first meet level 1, you must first meet level 1 prior to expending any funding on more advanced activities. Just as a reminder that for the purposes of grant funding use, school entities can also request funds to address gaps identified as part of an assessment conducted by an individual that's recognized on PCCD's School Safety and Security Assessor Registry, or for physical security assessments, an assessment conducted by the Pennsylvania State Police Risk and Vulnerability Assessment Team Unit, or the RVAT unit. This means that if a school entity does not meet all of their level 1 requirements, but has had a valid assessment done by a recognized assessor, they can use grant funding to help meet the identified gap within that professional assessment. When you have that green light of meeting all level 1 criteria for the respective area of your application that you're requesting funding for, you're eligible to then apply for other respective activities that are allowed for in the school code. Some of the bigger activities or items that schools use their funding on are included in the boxes included on the screen here. You can check out more details on the actual eligible activities on pages 5 through 8 of the written funding announcement. I would note that new to fiscal year 24-25 is the addition of a new behavioral health activity, which allows for funding to support the purchase of lockable cell phone bags. School entities should be aware that they would first need to meet level 1 baseline criteria in behavioral health prior to seeking funding to support the purchase of the lockable cell phone bags, as they are technically not a level 1 item. Further, schools opting for this funding would also need to adopt a policy that limits student cell phone use during the day. So now that we've covered what you can use grant funds for, let's talk about what you can't use them for. The funding announcement identifies a number of ineligible program activities and expenses that applicants should be mindful of, including asking for any item not included in the activities identified under section 1306-BJ of the PA Public School Code, and some expenses and activities that were explicitly referenced on page 9 of the written funding announcement that had been deemed ineligible by the School Safety and Security Committee. As noted on the slide, The eligibility of items or activities can also depend on whether or not your school entity has fully met level 1 baseline criteria standards. And occasionally, even if you have met level 1 criteria, please remember that school entities are limited to selecting appropriate eligible activities designated in the law and in the funding announcement. The focus of this funding is truly on meeting physical security needs and or the behavioral health needs of your students. Again, I would direct you to refer to the baseline criteria standards for ideas on what is an eligible activity or item to focus funding on. In addition to carefully reviewing the information in the written funding announcement document on allowable and unallowable uses of funds, we also encourage applicants to bear in mind some other financial considerations associated with this non-competitive funding announcement. First of all, you should carefully review the competitive bidding / sole source procurement section of the written funding announcement, which can be found on page 14. That section includes important procurement related information and requirements. We would also note that PCCD has approval of all final budgets. And in addition, grant funds must be used to supplement and not supplant existing spending on school mental health initiatives and programs, or physical security needs within a school entity. And speaking of supplementation, this is an area that PCCD often receives questions about from applicants, and it is a popular topic. So what is supplementation? The term supplant generally means to replace or swap out funding. You cannot use your school safety funding to replace or swap out other funds that you may have already designated to pay for activities, personnel, or items that are currently in your budget. You also cannot use these funds to retroactively support expenses already purchased or procured. For example, you can't be using grant funds to pay for the ongoing expenses as part of a previously executed contract or purchase order. On the flip side, however, it's perfectly fine to use school safety funding to support a position or activities if the funding for that position or activities is coming to a close and there's no other funding included or reoccurring in your budget to continue it. It's fine to continue to request school safety funds to support a similar purpose as in a prior school safety grant too. It's also okay to request additional funding to increase the hours for current personnel. For example, someone going from part-time to full-time, or increasing the total number of hours available, or in general to increase program activity or capacity. We know that school entities are juggling a lot in the areas of finance, and you're juggling a lot of different funding sources, especially a few from PCCD, and that sometimes supplementation can be an area that's very tricky to navigate. If at any time you have any questions about whether something is or isn't supplementation, we strongly encourage you to connect with your assigned fiscal staff on your grant to get additional situation-specific clarification. In addition to the financial considerations I just outlined, there are a couple of additional considerations that applicants should keep in mind for this funding announcement. First, Act 33 of 2023 amended the PA Public School Code to establish some new requirements related to Section 1319-B, which is the annual school safety incident data reporting to the Department of Education, and also relates to the MOU that your school entity should have with local law enforcement. Under these new amendments to the law, any school entity that fails to comply with these provisions may not be awarded any grant administered by PCCD until the school entity has come into compliance. So just be mindful of that as you move forward. In addition, PCCD staff have the authority to randomly audit and monitor grant recipients just to ensure the appropriate use of grant funds and compliance with provisions of the grant program, including verifying and satisfying level 1 baseline criteria. We would note that school entities that falsify information in their application may be subject to returning grant funding or other penalties allowed for by law. One more new requirement that came about of Act 55 of 2024, I need to highlight this, and it is a provision that only applies to the school districts in the state. Beginning with the 24-25 school year, All school districts must have at least one full-time school security personnel, which can be a school resource officer, a school police officer, or a school security guard, and that individual needs to be on duty during school hours. Personnel must have completed all the respective training required under Article 13-C of the PA Public School Code. I will note that if a school district does not meet this requirement, they can apply for a waiver, which will be good for 1 year from the School Safety and Security Committee. I would note that the waiver process is currently being set up at PCCD and will be communicated separately to all school districts once it's available. I would also note that school safety funding can be used to help meet this new personnel mandate. So now, having gone through that overview, let's talk about navigating the actual application process. Eligible school entities must submit their school safety and mental health grant application using PCCD's e-grant system in order to receive funding. Applications must be submitted electronically in our system by 11:59 p.m. on September 26, 2024. I will note that once you do get in the e-grant system, we have recently updated our e-grant system to include an e-signature process, and you will receive a prompt as soon as you're able to get into our system requesting that you sign up for this service. E-signature will allow your school's authorized users to electronically sign your application. This is in place of the ink and paper process that we used previously, and it should help to cut down on having to track down and mail a separate signature page document. To electronically sign the application, at least one person from your school entity must have the e-signature role in eGrants. There are links included in the PowerPoint here to access the instructions which explain how to request the e-signature role. I would note that the e-signature process does not need to be completed by the time you submit your application. You do have time to complete this process after the application period closes. But eventually, you will need to complete this process prior to receiving your award. As ever, if you should need any assistance in this process, we recommend contacting the eGrants Help Desk for assistance. But again, this process does not need to be done at the time of application, but it will be needed to be done before you receive your award. Pivoting now to the actual eGrants application. First, we will ask you to fill out the executive summary, which includes a very short script asking you to supply how much you're applying for and what you'll be expending the funds on. We provide a script for you to follow. It does not need to be super long or in depth, but we do ask that you please follow the script because we use that then to pull out summaries of what individual applicants are coming in for. There's a second section, which is for program activities, which is simply a list of all the program activities that are allowed for under this solicitation. You will be asked to just select the category or categories that best correspond with what you're seeking funding for. It's a checklist, just check what applies. Depending on what you're choosing to expend funding on, either a physical security item or a mental health related item, or potentially both, this solicitation then also includes two sections about the level 1 baseline criteria. One is for behavioral health and one is for physical security. You only need to fill out the section that applies to your request. These sections will look very similar to our fiscal year 23-24 competitive application, as we will ask you, the school, if you self-certify if you meet all of level 1 baseline criteria. We will also ask you if you've had an assessment completed of your school entity that was completed by either the state police RVAT unit or an individual listed on our school safety registry. Again, for the purposes of this solicitation, if you've had an assessment done by someone on our registry or PSP RVAT unit, it enables you to request funding for items or activities that they have identified as needed by your school entity. For those applicants that don't meet all of level 1 baseline criteria, there are some additional questions in those sections regarding each criteria. And then we ask you for some additional information about your status in meeting that criterion. The more detail you provide in this section, the better, as we purposely crafted this section to try to minimize having the need to go back and forth with you if we don't understand something. Finally, the budget details section will ask you to provide line item information such as personnel, benefits, consultants, training and travel, equipment and supplies, and construction and other about your request. The more detailed you are in this budget section, the better off you are, as our fiscal folks will return budget requests that are not completed correctly or thoroughly. As ever, applicants are strongly encouraged to carefully read and review the written funding announcement document prior to starting their application in PCCD's eGrants system. eGrants has a timeout feature on it, so if you don't utilize a page that you're on within 20 minutes, it times you out of the system. And unfortunately, it does not automatically save your work. It is much easier to prep all of your materials in advance prior to entering it into the eGrants system. Now, if after reading the funding announcement, you still have questions about the funding announcement or any questions in general, we would recommend that you first check the list of questions and answers, which is located under the active funding announcements webpage on our website. This is a running document that's updated routinely on our website with questions that we've received from schools such as yourself and our responses. We also have a link to the Q&A webpage on our handy one-pager documents too that are on the school safety page. Again, the questions and answers are updated on a routine basis, and it's quite possible that someone has already asked your question and the answer is already there. If you don't see a Q&A that corresponds with your question, please email the resource account, which is ra-cd-sssc@pa.gov, and put the title of the funding announcement in the subject line and pose your question. We will try to answer it as soon as possible. Some of the most frequently asked questions we get are on whether or not all level 1 standards must be met before school entities can use funds for other activities. As I just covered previously, yes, school entities need to meet all level 1 baseline criteria for behavioral health or physical security before they can use funds for more advanced eligible activities. If you have plans to meet your level 1 gaps when you outline them to us in other ways other than using this funding, you can let us know that in the application. But once that level 1 criterion is met, you can then use funding for any other eligible related project activity. New to this year, we have also gotten some questions related to school security personnel. A reminder, using these grant funds to support the costs associated with training and compensation of school security personnel is totally allowable. However, schools cannot use these funds to replace funding that's already being used for school security personnel that they have budgeted for. So, for example, if funding for the school security officers has been historically funded through the school district's budget, that potentially could fall under supplementation, which would be unallowable. But if the district is seeking funding to support a new position or expand your security personnel, that's fine. I would also note that since the school security personnel activity, which is called activity number 18 on the list of eligible activities, it falls under what's considered a physical security enhancement. So any school seeking funding for school security personnel should fill out the physical security baseline criteria section of the eGrants application. Continuing on with our questions related to supplementation, including whether grant funds can support personnel or programs that are already funded, budgeted for through previous grants that are ending. The answer to that question is yes. Generally speaking, PCCD does not consider requesting school safety funds for the same purpose in a previous PCCD school safety grant to be supplementation, particularly if your previous grant funding is coming to a close. Again, if you have concerns about possible supplementation, please reach out to the fiscal or program staff contacts listed in your grant and eGrants and pose that question to them. Also, if you happen to find yourself having some difficulties finalizing your application or meeting the tight timelines that we have, please do not fret. Just submit to us the most complete application you can by the end of the application period. We will always work with you on getting your project finalized, as these are formula-based funds and you are entitled to them. Finally, we've been fielding a few requests from folks about the new cell phone lock bag activity. We've provided some guidance on this new activity, which you can see here. Should a school want to pursue funding for this activity, we just want to remind you that the school should meet all other level 1 behavioral health criteria prior to being eligible to select this activity for grant funding. Further, the policy that the school entity has in place addressing cell phone use does not need to be a standalone policy per se. It can just be part of an existing device policy or in any other policy format that the school wishes. PCCD, for the purposes of grant making, just needs to confirm that a policy or statement exists that the school entity prohibits the use of cell phones during the day. As I wrap up, again, if after reading the funding announcement, you still have any questions about the funding announcement or any questions in general, you can always find the Q&A document on our active funding announcements webpage. If you don't see a question that corresponds to your particular question, please email us at ra.cd.ssse@pa.gov and let us know. Thanks so much for viewing this webinar for the fiscal year 24-25 School Safety and Mental Health Grants. We really appreciate your time and interest, and good luck with your applications.